It's my pleasure to welcome you to Connect2Peace, make light of the life of this world. This event is annually co-sponsored by the Peace Coalition of the Rock River Valley. I want to thank so many of my colleagues. Without whom this event would not be possible. Thank you for doing this great work. I also want to give special thanks to Jen and Pam Keeling for their vision, energy, passion, and commitment for bringing these great opportunities for dialogue to our community. Now, during last year's event, I had the pleasure of interviewing Raj Mahatma Gandhi's grandsons. As I thought about the event tonight, I thought of one of Gandhi's favorite quotes, and it is as follows. I object to violence because when it appears to do good, the good is only temporary. The evil it does is permanent. Now, tonight we'll be engaged in dialogue about several events, some during the Civil Rights era, others more recently, all of which were able to be handled and resolved in a peaceful fashion. So many other tragic events of recent times have resulted in violence and in discord. So the question before us tonight is whether or not we can extract lessons from the events we'll be talking about and move forward peacefully to help us in future endeavors. And joining me this evening is quite the distinguished panel. You have their bios in your program, so I will not read them word for word. Let me introduce them, nevertheless. Dr. Bass is a native of Georgia, a graduate of Simmons College, and an author, with her most recent book being Seeds of Freedom, The Peaceful Integration of Huntsville, Alabama. Esther will share her thoughts on how the integration of Huntsville during the early 1960s was accomplished at a time when other communities truly struggled to do so. Welcome, Esther.
Thank you.
Reverend Joseph Darby is a native of South Carolina. He's the presiding elder of the Beaufort District of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina. And prior to his appointment as presiding elder, Reverend Darby served as minister for Morris Brown AME Church for 14 years. Morris Brown is located just around the corner from Emmanuel AME Church, the church where 9 individuals were killed during Bible study in June of this year. Welcome, Reverend Darby. Dr. Michael Perry, Associate Professor of English and Chair of the Department at Rockford University, is an Augustana College, University of St. Thomas, and Arizona State University graduate. His teaching interest includes African American literature, and he is the founder of an annual campus event entitled Read Aloud of Black American Voices, which is conducted each February. Among many other insights, Dr. Perry will share events from Indianapolis on the evening that Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968. Welcome, Dr. Perry. Last but not least is John McNamara, Senior Development Officer with the University and former mayor of the city of Rockford, a Notre Dame graduate, a Vietnam veteran. Our community has its own stories from the Civil Rights era, and John will relay a particular issue on the same evening of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, April 4, 1968. Welcome, John. Let me take you back just a little ways. During the early to late 1960s, race riots broke out all across America. Detroit, Newark, Greensboro, Watts, and Mississippi, just to name a few. On the evening of April 4, 1968, following the news of Dr. King's assassination, riots broke out in 125 cities across our country. Robert Kennedy, U.S. Senator from New York, presidential candidate, and the brother of U.S. President, slain U.S. President John Kennedy, was scheduled to speak in Indianapolis on that evening of April 4th, 1968. Some say his speech was a factor and a reason why there were no riots in Indianapolis. We're now going to pause to hear that powerful speech prior to the beginning of our panel discussion.
All of you, and I think sad news for all of our fellow citizens and people who love peace all over the world. And that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis. Martin Luther King dedicated his life to love and to justice between fellow human beings. He died in the cause of that effort. In this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States, it's perhaps well to ask what kind of a nation we are and what direction we want to move in. For those of you who are black, considering the evidence evidently is that there were white people who were responsible, you can be filled with bitterness and with hatred and a desire for revenge. We can move in that direction as a country, in greater polarization, black people amongst blacks and white amongst whites, filled with hatred toward one another. Or we can make an effort, as Martin Luther King did, to understand and to comprehend and replace that violence, that stain of bloodshed that is spread across our land with an effort to understand compassion and love. For those of you who are black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and mistrust of the injustice of such an act against all white people, I would only say that I can also feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man. But we have to make an effort in the United States. We have to make an effort to understand, to get beyond or go beyond these rather difficult times. A favorite poem, my favorite poet was Aeschylus. He once wrote, "Even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God." What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence and lawlessness, but is love and wisdom and compassion toward one another, feeling of justice toward those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or whether they be black. We can do well in this country. We will have difficult times. We've had difficult times in the past, but we will have difficult times in the future. It is not the end of violence. It is not the end of lawlessness, and it's not the end of disorder. But the vast majority of white people and the vast majority of black people in this country want to live together, want to improve the quality of our life, and want justice for all human beings that abide in our land. I want to dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago: to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world. to that and say a prayer for our country and for our people. Thank you very much.
And panelists, here we go. Let's give you a specific question again, and we'll go from there. Esther, you're first. Please share with us the story behind your book, Seeds of Freedom. Include your thoughts on this historical liberation of Huntsville in the early 1960s, at a time when there wasn't a great deal of optimism for something happening overseas.
Thank you, Dr. Dad. It's my pleasure to be here today. Yes, I lived for 10 years in Huntsville, Alabama, and I was new to the community, and then I found out about the first instance of reverse integration and also the first instance of a integrated public school in Alabama, occurred in Huntsville within the same week. So I thought there must be a story there, and I asked people who had lived there in Huntsville all their lives, what about this story? And many people did not know it. And as I talked to my agent and my publisher about the story that I wanted to tell, they all said, wow, I've never heard of that. And I thought, isn't it interesting that everyone knows about the bombings in Birmingham, everyone knows about the violence on the bridge in Selma, but when there is a peaceful integration, it doesn't make the news. It didn't even make the news in Huntsville, enough that many people who grew up there did not know this story. So I would love to live in a world where peace makes news instead of violence. So this story has its roots in slavery. This was a community that was a cotton community. Slavery had been an integral part of their economy. And yet in the early 1960s, really beginning in the 1950s, this was Rocket City. This was the space center of the universe. So they were getting federal contracts. President Kennedy was very interested in sending a man to the moon. And they had welcomed German scientists who had been their enemies less than 20 years prior in World War II. And they could work beside them, people that they had been sworn enemies to just a short period before. And yet Black Americans who had been born there for generation after generation after generation could not take advantage of these jobs. They could buy a car in a car dealership, but they could not use the restroom. They could leave their money in the bank, but they could not work at the bank. So in a climate of just the way it is, that was how people justify segregation, many people began to realize that change is coming. So are we going to meet it with violence, such as in other communities in Alabama in particular, in Mississippi, or are we going to do something different? And as the Black leaders of the time said, animals fight, people negotiate. So they tried to speak to the white leaders. And again, this had been 100 years of just the way it is. So it was very hard to change hearts and minds at first, but the African Americans made peaceful effort after peaceful effort, as described in the book. And there are copies for sale, and I'll be happy to sign them after so that you can read the whole story. But basically, drop by drop, as Robert Kennedy was saying, drop by drop, even against their will, the wisdom came to the people of Huntsville. In just 6 months of peaceful demonstrations, they were able to negotiate a peaceful integration of the town. They just said, at a certain time, on a certain day, we're going to integrate our lunch counters. Black people and white people are going to sit down and have lunch together. And they did. And there wasn't any trouble. And a year later, they integrated the schools against the will of George Wallace, who was governor at the time. Everyone knows blatant racist, but they defied him. He was so angry about it that he diverted the interstates when they came through so that it did not go through Huntsville. But they defied him. And in fact, they defied him on every turn and said, we don't care what you want. We as a community want a peaceful integration. Now some would say, oh, it's because of all those federal space contracts. Perhaps that's true. That's okay. If that's what it took for them to realize, we have got to change 100 years of these people being treated as second-class citizens. So they were able to do it peacefully. I'm so proud to be able to bring this story to the forefront, a story that is a celebration of peaceful negotiation, peaceful, non-violent demonstrations to bring change to a community. So I see them as tremendous heroes. And in fact, Dr. Herford, who he was the civil rights leader, it was his son who was the 6-year-old who went to their school. They both still live in Huntsville, and they both still tell their story. And it's a very powerful story. So, that's a little bit about how that came to be.
Thank you, Esther.
Mhm.
John, now we're going to move forward just a few short years, a little closer to home. On the tragic day in April of 1968, there was an officer-involved shooting right here in Rockford, Illinois. Can you share with us what the climate of this community was at that point in time? Anything inherent in Rockford that caused it not to have the same kinds of violence as occurred in those days?
I'll do my best, Dr. Head. I will tell you that I arrived in Rockford in December 1st, 1966 to be a public defender. So I was here and active as a public defender at that time, but I had no personal recollection of an officer-involved shooting the same day that Martin Luther King was killed. So I asked a few friends at the news tower. In those days, we had 2 newspapers, a morning and an evening, if they could search the archives of April 4th, 5th, 6th, even 3rd, and see if there was an officer-involved shooting. And they found none. But what they did find was a shooting of a young black man, 17 years of age. I won't mention his name because it certainly would have no reason now in these circumstances. But he was with another person who ultimately was not involved in this attempted burglary, but it was the burglary of a TV store on West State Street, 1010 I believe it was, West State Street. And the owner of the store had been burglarized 15 times in the last 4 years. And so he had a habit of pretty often sleeping in the store at night. And so he was in the store this night when the glass was broken, and he woke up, got his pistol, and he began firing out of the window toward the alley, I believe it was, and 2 shots struck the young 17-year-old black male. He stumbled away and then actually collapsed right by his friend who had come with him. He was taken to the hospital and died several hours later. It's the only thing I could find in that, and what was really interesting was that, you know, the store had been burglarized so often that this man decided he ought to stay there. Looking at the newspaper articles, there was no uproar about this incident at all. And I think for several reasons. Number one, it was not a shooting by a police officer to any individual, black or white. And that, you know, it was said by both the police and later by the state's attorney, who was Bill Nash, who became a judge maybe 4 or 5 years later. He was a tough state's attorney, I would tell you. And they both decided that there was no reason to arrest Mr. I think it was Samuelson. And then to kind of put the cap on it, the coroner called for an inquest, and they had an inquest, kind of a jury, if you would, of 6 people. They were all men, 5 black men and 1 white man. The verdict was unanimous that there was nothing, no reason to press charges of any criminal nature against the owner of the store. So I think the best I could find, Dr. Head, there was no, law enforcement shooting of anyone the night that Dr. King died. What was the atmosphere at that time? I would say, you know, the atmosphere I found, I thought was relatively stable. We knew good friends who were black, and in fact, as soon as we arrived in Rockford, every New Year's Eve we'd go down to Papa Hawk's and celebrate with mostly African American couples and some mixed couples and some white like we were. And so we already had a lot of friends in the school system, and were impressed that at least we thought that the faculty and some of the principals were African American, and it was in good shape. I think that, you know, at that time, most people were really concerned about the schools. Quite frankly, as they are today, as they were 10 years ago, as they were 20 years ago in Rockford, and also in the 70s when there was a federal lawsuit, or maybe it was the 90s, pardon me, I think there was two, attached to us, and we ended up with an overseer of our school system, really about not so much integration, but the conditions of the schools that were predominantly black and those that were not. What was interesting is at that time, the Black Panthers were organized and active in Rockford. I represented them quite regularly, and quite frankly, I became friends with several of them. And what was really interesting is that they were not like the gangs of today, where there was indiscriminate shooting all over, with absolutely no reason whatsoever. Drive by, didn't like the car, or whatever have you, you start shooting, and guns were prevalent. But what they were proposing, among other things, was to have a medical clinic for the poor on the west side in the poor neighborhoods. A doctor who recently died a year ago, Dr. John McHugh, picked up on that, and also talked to several of the members of the gang, and that led to what is now Crusader Clinic. You may have read recently that they, I think, have now just building their 5th clinic in the greater Rockford area, and that was really in part, obviously a strong part by Dr. McHugh and his wife, who was a nurse, but also by the Black Panthers, several of which are still in town, and I see, and sometimes I see the one at the golf course on the west side, Ingersoll Course. So I think overall it was pretty calm. The other reason I think was that the senior leadership of the black churches were very strong, very deeply involved in the community, well respected, and did not put up with a lot of shenanigans by anybody. You had Elbridge Gilbert, who later, before this, became friends with Dr. King and his wife. You had Pastor Claiborne Salter. Pastor Gilbert was pastor of Pilgrim Baptist Church. Reverend Salter was at Zion Church just down the street from Washington, now grade school, I believe, and several others. And also, there were some strong women who were active in the school system. Marcella Harris was very active. Connie Lane, Margie Sturgis was really a firebrand, and she was on the parole board. So, you know, we felt in some ways that this was new to town. We've been here, let's say, 2 years. We found it very refreshing, and it boosted my confidence in the decision to move to Rockford and see the strength of the community. And the only other thing I would tell you is when Barb and I arrived in Rockford, we stopped at the Albert Pick, which was in its Alpine and East State Street, to have a cup of coffee before we interviewed for a job. The waitress was very nice, but after she was looking at me all dressed up for an interview as a public defender, and Barbara was looking at the one ads, or the classified section, and she asked Barbara what she was doing, and Barbara said that she was looking for an apartment, that her husband was interviewing for a job. And the waitress, who very nice, but without dropping a stitch. She said, well, don't live on the west side. And so immediately we got in our car and drove over to the west side. And we've been there ever since. So, you know, it shows you how much we love Rockford.
Dr. Barrett, the speech we just heard earlier about eternity, inspiring. What are your thoughts on the speech and the surroundings of that speech, the legacy of it, and the event that speech was actually the cause for nonviolence in Indianapolis and
Well, I don't think it's the cause. I think it's a cause. I think you mentioned a factor, right? And certainly that's part of it. And you could say that the reason why there were no riots is the community chose not to riot for whatever reason, right? But I think there's definitely something, you can't divorce one from the other as well. I was trying to figure out how best to kind of discuss this, and you know, there's the stories that surround it where his handlers or his crews warned him about heading in there, and he said, no, I'm going in to the community, the playground, and I'm going to give that speech. It's important to do so, and so I think that's an interesting aspect. But I thought instead I would kind of just look at the speech itself, right, and put on my English professor hat. And you all have the speech in front of you, so you can be in a big giant classroom and read along. And to kind of look at some of the things that he's doing in the actual speech, where he comes out in the beginning and without kind of any preamble says, look, this is what has happened. Martin Luther King was shot and killed. And I think in that second part what's interesting where he says, you can be filled with bitterness, with hatred, and a desire for revenge. He doesn't say, don't be filled with hatred, with bitterness, and with a desire for revenge. And I think that's a key element there. He's not standing up there and preaching and telling his audience what to think or how to behave and speaking about them or for them, but he's speaking to them. And I think that's a key kind of discourse that he gets at that point. It's something that James Baldwin discusses in The Fire Next Time, where he mentions in The Fire Next Time, James Baldwin kind of calls out hypocrisy on all levels, and one of them is this idea of he talked about white liberals. They want to speak for and about, but they don't want to speak to. They don't want to see us as men. And I think he sees these communities as men and women, but as people. And you see that in the speech. And that was kind of a key moment. And then we can move in that direction as a country, the greater polarization, or we can take the other path. It's about Martin Luther King, but it's really more about Martin Luther King's vision. And if we go back to that vision again and again, and if we can grasp that vision, and if we can, the only way to honor that vision is to kind of embody what he stands for. And then in good old rhetorical fashion, if I'm putting on my rhetoric teaching hat instead of my English hat, establishing common ground in different ways, where he says, look, I had a member of my family killed. He was killed by a white man, but he also, he's not gonna skirt around the issue of race either. That there's different ways of seeing this, and I think being able to discuss race is a very difficult thing, and it still is today. And for him to go in there and do that in that particular way, and then to not again speak for or about, to speak to, and not to speak down to, as he references Aeschylus. And even in our sleep, you just have to read this again real quick. Even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God. There's so many ways to think about that. But if you're looking at that particular moment, you're talking 100 years out of past the emancipation of slavery, and we still haven't got it out. We still haven't got it right. 100 years since the emancipation, and there's still not equality. And if you think of that, the pain which we cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until eventually we're going to get this. Eventually we're going to have wisdom. And you can see him thinking, that's what I'm hoping is going to happen. It may have not happened yet, and I would say even right now, we're still waiting for full wisdom to come. But I think it's that reference of wisdom in Aeschylus, and then you could also look at the biblical reference of the way that's used, say in Proverbs or something. It's an interesting kind of dynamic. Right after that, according to Aeschylus, then he goes into repetition. He uses that kind of what we need in the United States, he's echoing, the way that Martin Luther King would do, the way that it would work in kind of in Black culture, that almost like a call and response. You can see him like almost wanting to get that response from them. And then he just tells them direct. So what I ask you guys to do tonight when you return home, say a prayer for the family of Martin Luther King, yeah, but more importantly, say a prayer for our own country. So he kind of puts it out on them. Did this result in there not being, I'm sure it helped. I'm sure it's part of it. And does it make a great story if we say yes, it does, and we make monuments about it? It does, but it also risks that idea of that the community needed RFK to come in and save them, and that's problematic in itself. That's a whole other kind of narrative that we hear far too often, I think, in film and in literature. We have kind of the white savior who comes in and saves. I don't think that's necessarily helpful as well, but it's also not helpful to kind of completely disregard the connection, if that makes sense.
First, thanks for inviting. Secondly, the Walter Scott shooting did not happen in a vacuum. It's one of a chain of shootings, not only in Charleston, but across the country, that just came into national prominence very likely after the Trayvon Martin incident. Prior to that incident, there was another young man who was shot and killed by the Charleston County Sheriff's Department because he had some emotional problems, threw a closed knife at a sheriff's deputy from about 10 feet away and tried to climb a fence, and he was shot. There was an incident by the Charleston Police Department where an off-duty officer got to tussling with the young man that he thought was suspicious, and somehow managed, the young man who was left-handed somehow managed to pull his gun from his left pocket, and shoot himself in the right side of the head. That happened before Walter Scott. The difference in Walter Scott is that video does not lie. The difference in Walter Scott is that even though they have rolled out his rap sheet, even though there are questions now about whether there was a physical altercation with the officer, what does not lie is cell phone video of an officer basically doing target practice, shooting from about 10 to 12 feet away. There's no way that you feel for your life in that instance. The Emmanuel tragedy was equally horrendous, if not more than horrendous in some ways. Kind of feel back to the 16th Street Baptist churches in little girls. Same kind of thing, same kind of motivation. A young man who followed the wrong kinds of cues, and because of that decided to take 9 lives. And it shook the community, and I think it shook the nation, because this was not an officer-involved shooting. These were not folk who could in any dubious manner be painted as having somehow contributed to what happened. They were in church, and they were murdered by someone who said in video and in writing, "I want to kill black people." And I think that those things contributed to the way that Charleston handled it. And I think the video leading to a very speedy identification of the officer and a very speedy arrest, the miraculously speedy interception of the young man who was fleeing after he killed those folks. I think those things kind of kept the city from exploding. I think the other thing, though, that contributed in Charleston is that Charleston and the South in general practices something I call raging politeness. We are relentlessly polite to each other. And because of that, Some people just do not see it as polite to do anything except say quietly things should go better. Sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes that's a bad thing because their peace change. But I think that played a factor. I think the forgiveness extended by the Emmanuel families also played a factor in that grace. With the understanding, you know, that there are two things about that grace that need to be clear. One of those is that it actually is supposed to be hardwired into their faith, my faith, that we believe that we have a Messiah who forgave his killers, that we are supposed to do the same thing. That gets lost sometimes in today's misrepresentation of Christianity by those on the Christian right who very often don't act Christian and very often ain't right. They have more Christianity of vengeance than Christianity of love. But forgiveness is supposed to be hardwired. And if you are talking about the historically black church, talking about the heirs of those who grew up in slavery. That's where they embraced the religion, and it became a coping mechanism. And if you could be brutalized, raped, have your children sold, whatever, and yet you still had to interact with these people who claimed to own you each day without killing them. If you couldn't get away, how did you do that? You learned to forgive and you moved on. So I think all of those things came together to cause Charleston to react as it reacted. I think in the current climate, had officers, Slater not been charged very quickly, there might have been more tension. Had the Emmanuel killer not been immediately apprehended and there was immediate outrage, there might have been more tension. But all of those things, I think, came together to give us the result that we had.
Thank you, everybody. The next series of questions I'm going to throw out, and feel free to jump in. Any similar points that you might have, feel free to do that as well. A couple of you have already touched on maybe some lessons that we learned from these incidents, but I'll just throw that back out as we go. What are some lessons that we learned from Huntsville, Indianapolis, and Charleston that can help guide our way moving forward?
Well, I can share something that I think, I was back in Huntsville in February sharing this book with the community, and many of them came up to me afterwards and said, you know, it's like what I learned from those people's courage to stand up and do things in a way that was not being done by the communities of their surrounding area. They chose peace. It was a conscious choice. And what people came up and told me, they said, you know what, it's like, what I realized, if I want the world to change, I'm responsible. And the idea of personal responsibility, I think, is probably my number one crusade right now is that there is a lot of frustration in this country. There is a lot of anger. I mean, one look at what's going on in the political climate. I mean, to hear RFK speak in such measured, educated, moderate tones, the extreme viewpoints of so many people in this country that they feel, and they have every right to express, but it's that extreme quality. Where's the moderation? Where's the conciliatory nature? Where is the compromise that this country so sorely needs? I mean, that's what RFK was calling for. Can we walk in the shoes of our enemy, and can we have compassion? Can we have forgiveness? We have to. So that one of the main lessons, I think, also they were talking about this, and I hope they're talking about this in other communities, is that, you know, we teach algebra in schools, and how many people have used algebra in their lives if you're not a mathematician? But do we teach compassion? Do we teach forgiveness? Do we teach tolerance? Do we teach cooperation? Do we teach compromise? Those are the things that I think we have to start with the children. And both Martin Luther King, Gandhi, who said you have to start with the children and teach them how to get along.
I would just say that we have to listen. And if we don't, if if the community doesn't feel like there's anything to lose, then it's going to be harder for it to be a nonviolent, what is at stake in yeah, I guess listen more. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but I think provide a place where they can speak, but it's difficult.
I think a lot of people's frustration and anger comes from the fact that they feel no one is listening to them.
I think there has to be some relationship built. Something similar to what happened in Huntsville, happened in Columbia, South Carolina, across South Carolina. And I remember the pictures from those days, and uncles who were involved in the civil rights movement. Pictures that show the president of the NAACP and the president of the captain of the state's law enforcement division glaring at each other in public, saying rude things about each other in public. But then in the evening coming together and saying, okay, we're going to have to make this work. How do we do that? They built a relationship and actually became friends. It's interesting that that gentleman's son and my son are now very good friends. And one of his law partners is African American. So building the relationships helps. The other thing is having frank and ongoing dialogue. We tend to sugarcoat things. It's one of the reasons why I'm looking forward to seeing what happens a year after Emmanuel, because there's been a great outpouring of love from all over the world for Emmanuel AME Church. Now, either that is the beginning of a dialogue or it's a long extended kumbaya, where everybody will suddenly say, we have done so good, we feel so good, aren't we wonderful, because we weren't like that killer. He was an individual, he was a lone wolf. Although, if you look at it in many other killings of similar natures across the country, a bunch of lone wolves makes a pack. And so you have a pattern. When you acknowledge that, when you engage in constructive dialogue, I think that helps. And when that dialogue then leads to positive action that spills over into public policy, changing schools, integrating schools, passing necessary laws to see to the well-being of all people, I think that makes a difference.
I think I certainly agree with that. I think in reading your book, Esther, and learning more, and just, I guess, my own experience, I think that the people of Huntsville obviously have a plan. Now, not every step was laid out, but I think what they saw was that, small incremental change could have big dividends. Just one, they were talking about you could go into any of these, let's say, department stores, or in the old days, if you had a Woolworth or something that had clothes and other things to sell, but they also had a lunch counter that, the black families could go in there and spend all the money that they had, but they couldn't have lunch. But one day, two people decided to sit down. Nobody threw them out. Nobody swore at them, apparently, and no big fuss with that, the newspapers. And so I think they took that, accepted that as a pretty good first step. And then they went on, I don't know whether it was weeks or months, it's hard to tell.
It took 6 months.
Yeah, but over that period of time, they kept on doing smaller things. You were not, if you were black, allowed to go into the parks. The public parks were for the white people. Well, then, somebody took their children and the swings in a park, and nobody threw them out. Nobody called the police. Nobody did that. And so it was these small things that I guess the white folks of Huntsville were willing to accept, and then they ultimately led to this enormous change in the school system. What do parents hold more dear? How's the school for my child? So I think that, the small things and a little bit of a plan. I'm sure they were thinking what would be next, what would be next. It would be kind of easy to do, or no violence. Leads to incremental change, which is really very, very positive.
And I think when you have a goal in mind, no one knows what effort is going to be required to accomplish that goal until you have accomplished that goal. So in each case, the steps that they took, just having a demonstration was not enough, having sittings was not enough, step by step by step. But the important thing is that there were men and women and children willing and courageous enough to take those steps. And it says we have to talk about race. We have to listen to each other. And someone has to be courageous enough to do it. So thankfully, it was Dr. Rockford and his colleagues who were willing to confront it, but confront it in a peaceful way,
to move beyond kumbaya requires systematic planning as well as love, as well as listening, right? It has to be more organized. And I think maybe that's what we're missing today is organization.
The next question I have for you is kind of an extension of that one. In 2008, Barack Obama was elected President of the United States. Right after the election, we heard lofty statements about progress towards being a colorblind society. With all the incidents that we've had over the course of the last 7 years, where do you think we are in terms of our progress towards dealing with the within the United States of America?
Can I do that one first?
Sure.
Moving at the speed of an arthritic turtle. It somehow gave license to folks to exercise their greatest fears, greatest insecurities. So you saw a wave of racial insults, you saw a wave of things being said in the media that at one time, 10, 15 years ago would have been unacceptable and insulting, suddenly became acceptable. The present presidential primary process is evidence of things that once would have been unthinkable have suddenly garnered support. That's the change that's come that shoots down the idea that we're in a post-racial society. I don't think we've made as much progress as we should have. At the same time, it has sensitized some people to do the right thing. It's causing people to start to reach out and to engage in dialogue. So we have not come nearly as far as we should have. The laws of the 1960s outlawed some things, but laws do not change hearts. Hearts change when people talk together, talk things out together, get to accept each other, affirm each other, acknowledge their own shortcomings, and then that makes a difference. The turtle speeds up.
I think it's interesting that he is only spoken of as America's first black president, and the fact is he's biracial. He has a white mother and a black, actually an African. So he's more African American, say, than even some people would like to admit. But I just think it's interesting that no one really talks about the fact that he is biracial. He's just as white as he is black. He's always the black president. So I just find that interesting. So is it possible to be colorblind? I don't know. We're not there yet, that's for sure. Is it possible? Because in some ways, it's like the cultural identity that is tied up in race is part of what makes people so interesting. So it's not, their color is not something I want to be blind to. I want to accept and understand. So that's what I'm looking for.
Yeah, I always thought that when I first met you, I'm colorblind, I don't see color, and to me that seems naive on some level. I mean, we don't want to necessarily not, or we can't not see color. You don't have a choice, and to many of us in different degrees. But we were just reading in my blues class today, James Baldwin, and he talks about before the invention of color. That concept right there is the idea of color is something that we as humans invented. So it's possible, right? We at one point we decided white, right? We decided black, we decided brown, and so it was a conscious decision. But regardless of whether or not we agree with it, either way, it's there. But it's so hard to talk about, and maybe that's what we need to be able to talk about it.
I guess I have a couple of thoughts about this. I really like your thoughts on this. To me, what's really interesting is that we have maybe somewhat of a similar instance here in Rockford that while we've had a lot of black leaders, we did not have a black elected person. So when I was mayor from 81 to 89, four-year term, so I was elected twice. By overwhelming margins of perhaps 1% in 1981, and by can tell you this exactly. 178 votes out of 146 precincts in 1985. So when I was first elected, I asked Charles Box, who I knew and admired much, and my partner Mary Gorman was a good friend of his, and we became friends, and I was actually a friend of his older brothers first, and so I asked Charles to be our legal director, and he agreed. He was working for a real good firm. He agreed, and so he was our legal director for 6 years, and then I knew I was not going to run again. We, by that time, had 6 children, and I thought I should stay home. Whether Barbara wanted me to or not. But anyway, so Tom Meyer, who was a great guy, and a classmate in high school of Charles, we worked on Charles for 2 years to run. Very shy guy. So he ran. And the first guy who ran against him just really went after him because he was single, he was not a family man, and he wouldn't know these responsibilities. And as a matter of fact, Charles was the most family man I had ever met, as he worked hard not only for the city of Rockford, but for the barbecue place that his parents had, and his dad died early, and Charles would leave the city hall and go down to Marcus Arnold Drive to Box's Barbecue and close up and do the money and all the accounting and so forth, and come home. So Charles ran. He ran successfully 3 times. The first time he won by 63% of the vote. Now, I wasn't really envious of that, but I wondered how the hell he did it, but and where I had screwed up so much. But the second time he won by 67%, and the third time I think it was somewhere in the mid-60s. And so I thought, wow, this is really saying something. And Charles did a great job. But even then, in those days, that was the days when we ended up with I can't remember what they call the man, the federal government appoints him, almost like a receivership or something, that was going to be in charge of the Rockford school system. Thank you. Those were painful days for Charles, very difficult for the community, but it really shows that in some ways the strength of Rockford. And here's this man who then overwhelmingly elected 3 times in a row. You get 60% of anything, and especially a political race, and you are really doing well. So I think there's strength in the community at that time, and it was really important to see. I think it said a lot about Rockford as a community.
Thanks, John. I have one more question for you. I'm going to hold it. There are 2 things I want to accomplish before we wrap up. One is I asked our students to provide questions for me, and they did those. So I'm going to make sure I use a couple of them. And then I want to give the audience a chance to answer questions as well. So let me ask a couple of questions from our students. One of our students was a student enough to recognize that Dr. King used the media to provide in the living rooms of all injustice in our country. Volcano, dogs, fire hoses. Today the media is taking a different slant. It's our citizens with cell phones, cameras, this new media. How do you think it's playing out in racial tensions, racial reconciliation, hopefully, and how should Americans, particularly minority Americans, feel about this?
I think it should lead to reconciliation. I think it's a tool that could be helpful for that, because part of dealing with a problem is an acknowledgement that there is a problem. The relationship between law enforcement and the African-American community didn't just suddenly get bad. People have been profiling for God knows how long, since I was a child. But the difference is that now with the availability of video, the availability not only to record but to post it on that social media, then you get a starker image of what's going on. It takes away the suggestion that something is exaggerated, that something is out of place. One of the things that came up this week as a result of the Walter Scott case, because the officer, his lawyer tried to get him bonded out of court. He didn't get bonded out. But in the process of arguing, he acknowledged something that people in North Charleston have been complaining about for years, that North Charleston police officers have a quota. They're supposed to stop at least 4 drivers a day. They call that community policing in North Charleston. And that would never have come to light if not for that video, because if it weren't for that video, the officer would have just been all thrown away and been back on the streets. I think that shows the power of how it can make a difference when people see that kind of thing. It puts a face on the people can identify with. And it starts to be what Dr. King talked about. What Dr. King did. America didn't just see people getting brutalized. They saw people like them, folks who stopped to pray before they were brutalized. And when you see people like you, then that starts to give you a different perspective.
I think it's true what Roberta said. When there is a video of an incident, the video does not lie. A picture is worth 1,000 words. I can tell you what I saw, but if I can show you what I saw, I think that is ever more powerful. So it's the adage I heard at the airport today: if you see something, say something. If you see something going on that isn't just a quota of stopping 4 people a day, that's ridiculous. So that should be brought to light. We used to depend on our broadcasters to do that for us, to uncover and expose. And really, it has become, again, coming back to personal responsibility, it has become everyone's job to expose what's going on that is unjust in this country. As you bring it to light, and talk about it, and photo to show, then perhaps we have a chance at change.
You think about how it was organized with Martin Luther King, right? Where they knew they wanted it on film in order for the public to see it. And I think maybe that's where the cell phone coverage, sometimes it can be, sometimes it's spur of the moment. But again, that would be a place where we have this access to shed a light on. If there was, like, maybe if there were more organization, and we could see what is that, how do we make that more systematic?
I can barely read my Next question. I received this question from several students. We want to understand your thoughts on the impact of the removal of the Confederate flag in South Carolina.
Sadly, it took so long to happen because nobody got shot until the Emmanuelists. People have been calling for that flag to come down ever since it went up. It went up during the 60s. Supposedly to commemorate the centennial of the Civil War. Just happened to coincide with the time that the South was gearing up its systematic resistance to Brown v. Board, to desegregating schools. And since it's gone up, there have been increasing cries. Those cries evolved eventually into the NAACP boycott against South Carolina 15 years ago. But the flags coming down was a result of folks getting killed. Someone made a comment, one of our media people the other day, it's a shame that we got flagged down because 9 good people got killed. South Carolina swiftly passed body camera legislation because Walter Scott got killed. We have to reach the point where folks don't get killed for progress to take place. The flag coming down is a positive thing. We've been working for it, but it's still just a symbol. The same legislators who reacted to the Emmanuel horror and the grace of those people who forgave by taking the flag down in less than 2 weeks have to come together and do something about equity in public education, have to do something about taking away a voter ID law that does not, that's unnecessary because there's no proof of any voter fraud. Needs to do something about infrastructure across the state so that they're good jobs. It's good that the flag is down. But if the flag's coming down leads to something else positive, then it goes from symbolism to substance. That's good.
I just a symbol. And it is a shame that something so tragic has to occur before these symbols seen for what they are. If you look, I mean, my great-great-great-great-grandfather was a Confederate colonel. So it's a big part of my own family's history in Georgia. I have absolutely zero attachment to that as a symbol. To me, it means nothing except what I recall in my childhood was that the Ku Klux Klan used it. We would see them using it when they were circling around the state capitol in Atlanta. And in my family, I was not raised with prejudice. People think that all Southerners are prejudiced. We're not. And when I went to school in Simmons in Boston, people had a lot of misconceptions about who Southerners were. But to me, it became a symbol of hatred because of how the KKK and other people such as this deranged young man with a gun, how they used it and how they saw it. So absolutely, it needs to come down. We don't display the Nazi flag, we don't display the Confederate flag because of what it stands for. So these symbols are hurtful and powerful, and we need to give them less power. We need to take them down.
One more question from our students submitted earlier, and then we'll open up for questions from the audience. It seems that there are less black church leaders who are politically active regarding the civil rights movement. Was the black church more prevalent than it is now? Or is there a difference?
You really want to get me started.
I do.
Black church is not doing nearly as much as it should, to be quite frank. During the civil rights era, the black church was the staging ground for civil rights marches, particularly in the South, where there was serious segregation, legal segregation. It was the place of recreation, it was the place of job training, it was the place in a number of things. In the North, it was the place that folks fled in the South. They would become acculturated to the North by joining the church. There's an Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, an Emmanuel AME Church in Harlem, and the membership is related because people would go from one Emmanuel to the other Emmanuel. We had that history, and clergy were necessarily leaders because it was easier for you to speak if your job was not threatened, if you were paid by people who essentially agreed with you, and people said things that those people could not say. What has happened over the years is that in some churches that broad spectrum of work has diminished into what's basically Sunday aerobics. Folks just get together and have a good time on Sunday. What is it called? For some of my colleagues, sad to say, is that they're far more concerned about the size and the prestige of their pulpits than they are about the conditions of the people in their communities. So I don't think the church is doing enough. And I think, though, my faith tells me that when we don't do enough, the Creator kind of nudges us back into situations where you end up having to do enough again. America's trucking along in that direction, and I think you're seeing more clergy getting involved now.
I would say it's not just the black churches. I would say, again, it goes back to personal responsibility. What are the white churches doing? What are, what are Muslims doing? What are atheists doing? What is everybody doing to try to have some kind of civil discourse in this country about getting down to basics, as Barbara Kennedy was speaking about? What kind of country do we want to be? So yeah, I mean, when I was growing up in the 60s, we were all kind of, I don't know, radicalized. If we saw something we wanted changed, we went out and did something about it. I don't see that in my children's generation. I don't see that in young people coming up. They don't have that sense of social activism enough. So, yeah, it's not just black churches that are maybe not doing enough, it's all of us. And what are we all doing to make the world a better place?
If I could back up and add something, there's one thing that can be done, and I think it cuts across the diverse spectrum of people of faith. Churches, synagogues, mosques are wonderful places to start dialogue. Sometimes unintentionally good things happen. When I was pastor of Mars around AME, we entered into a dialogue with Circular Congregational Church in Charleston, the United Church of Christ. They make us look theologically conservative. And so, you know, the first few meetings were kumbaya meetings. Everybody was on the same page, and it didn't get real until they were planning a joint event, and we were looking at dates. And one of the dates was the day that the mayor Charleston gave away school supplies. One of the very well-intentioned people from Syracuse said, that's a bad date, because that means that some of the families from Morris Brown can't get there. And one of my folks said, why would the families from Morris Brown be more interested in school supplies than the families at Syracuse? That's when the dialogue turned in a real direction.
All right, we have a few minutes left, and we want to have an opportunity for you to ask questions of our panelists. I want to recognize that we have a couple of students somewhere floating around with microphones right here in front of me. And the members of the Black Student